Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening the files on a case that really forced the American judiciary to confront this new frontier of criminal responsibility in the digital age.
hmm
Our focus is the death of 18-year-old Conrad Roy III and the highly unusual involuntary manslaughter conviction of Michelle Carter.
And this deep dive is really an investigation into the facts surrounding that tragedy in 2014 in Fairhaven, Massachusetts.
Yeah,
It's often called the texting suicide case, and its foundation is, it's truly unique.
it really is.
The legal ruling was based almost entirely on the content of scores of digital communications, texts, emails, and phone calls between two young people who were both struggling profoundly with their mental health.
We absolutely have to approach this deep dive with great care and, immense sympathy for Conrad Roy and his family. The tragic loss of a young man, especially one with such ambition and potential, it's just paramount here. So our mission is strictly factual. We want to trace the exact pathway the Massachusetts court took to determine that words spoken remotely over a cell phone could actually constitute the criminal act of involuntary manslaughter.
And, to understand that legal rationale, it requires us to sort of set aside that immediate emotional reaction and look purely at the facts that were presented in the court materials.
Exactly.
The prosecution, they successfully argued that under very, very specific circumstances, Michelle Carter's digital communication amounted to criminal coercion. And to really grasp that mechanism, we have to first understand the person who was the victim in this unprecedented legal battle.
Okay, so let's begin by piecing together the life of Conrad Roy III. He was born September 12, 1995, in Mattapoisett, Massachusetts. And the court documents, they really paint this dual picture of a high achiever who is also facing this immense personal struggle.
They do.
What stands out immediately is his professional maturity for his age.
It's remarkable, frankly. Conrad was already deeply involved in his family's business, Tucker Roy Marine Towing and Salvage. And this wasn't, just some summer job.
Yeah.
He was dedicated to marine salvage. In the spring of 2014, which was just months before his death, he earned his captain's license from the Northeast Maritime Institute.
And that's after 3 months of rigorous night classes.
Right. I mean, that is a significant professional certification. It highlights leadership, a defined career path, things that very few 18-year-olds possess.
And beyond his professional life, his academic and athletic profile was just stellar. He was an honor roll graduate from Old Rochester Regional High School.
With a 3.88 GPA.
Really impressive.
Very impressive. He was active in multiple sports, baseball, crew, track, and he'd already been accepted to Fitchburg State University to pursue a business degree. So his future, on the surface, it looked completely set. And this contrast between that public success and the private agony, that's a critical piece of this whole puzzle.
Yeah.
Because despite all these external accomplishments, the court records show that Roy was struggling intensely with social anxiety and severe depression.
Right.
His mental health journey was known. It was documented. He had been seeing various mental health professionals, including a cognitive behavioral therapist, right up until the weeks leading to July of 2014.
And we know his struggles had led to a prior attempt. In October 2012, when he was just 17 after his parents' divorce, that incident involved an acetaminophen overdose, and he was hospitalized for it. This history confirms that his suicidal ideation wasn't something that was triggered solely by his relationship with Michelle Carter. It was a deep-seated mental health issue that he was actively trying to manage.
And that shared foundation of struggle is so key to understanding the dynamic of their relationship. Michelle Carter, who was born in August 1996, was also managing her own significant mental health issues. She was dealing with anxiety, with depression, and the court records detail that she was prescribed citalopram, which is known commercially as Celexa, in 2014.
And that medication detail is something the defense really tried to elevate during the pretrial motions. Both Roy and Carter were taking citalopram.
Right.
And the source material points out that in the United States, this class of antidepressant carries what's known as a black box warning, or a boxed warning.
Which is the most serious warning the FDA can require.
Exactly. And this warning specifies the potential risk of increasing suicidal thinking and behavior, particularly in people under the age of 24, and especially when they're first starting the treatment or changing their dosage.
The defense really saw this as a potential mitigating factor. They argued that the drug could have chemically influenced the erratic and disturbing nature of their text exchanges.
That it could have lowered inhibitions, maybe, or increased impulsive behavior?
For both of them, yeah. They even requested funds to hire an expert on Celexa to testify on this very point.
And the judge, Judge Moniz, He dismissed that request. He called it speculative. Why do you think he shut down an area of inquiry that seems so relevant to both of their states of mind?
That decision, it really underscores the court's very narrow focus. Judge Moniz was signaling early on that he was not going to put the mental health establishment on trial,
Okay.
nor was he going to allow the defense to attribute the tragedy solely to the complexities of pharmacotherapy.
Yeah.
He wanted to focus purely on the actions and the intent that were documented in their communications.
So by calling it speculative, he essentially boxed the trial into establishing this chain of causation through the texts themselves, rather than getting into a huge, complex psychiatric debate.
Precisely. Now, if we look at the nature of their connection, it's really defined by that digital distance. They met in Florida in 2012 while they were visiting relatives.
Right, but they only lived about 35 miles apart in Massachusetts.
And yet the source material confirms they only saw each other in person a handful of times, over 2 years.
So it was overwhelmingly a text-based relationship.
Completely. Intimate yet detached. Conducted almost entirely through screens. And the sheer volume is just staggering. Thousands of texts and emails exchanged.
And initially those exchanges, they really suggested a supportive dynamic.
They did. When Roy discussed suicide back in 2012 and early 2014, Carter repeatedly urged him to get professional help. She discouraged the suicidal thoughts.
So the relationship was initially structured around, one person supporting the other through this shared vulnerability. The turning point, the sort of narrative hinge that the prosecution really relied upon, was this drastic shift in Carter's attitude in July of 2014.
Yes, that shift is really the difference between what could be considered protected speech and what the court saw as criminal intent. The source materials clearly document that she moved from support to encouragement to a point where she began thinking it would be, and this is a quote, a good thing to help him die.
That phrase is just. It's indicative of a conscious, active decision to facilitate the end of his life.
It is. And this also brings us back to a text from June of 2014, so this is before the final plan really took shape. Roy had suggested that they act like Romeo and Juliet.
Implying the shared, kind of romanticized ideation of a suicide pact.
Exactly. That Romeo and Juliet reference is haunting because it suggests this fantasy of a joint action. But what happened in July? It moved beyond fantasy. It became a coercive reality.
So the key point is that the court had evidence of Carter's internal dialogue,
Documented in her own text to her friends.
where she explicitly admitted her intent to encourage him and eventually her direct role in those final moments. This self-incrimination, recorded digitally, is what made the prosecution's case viable.
Without a doubt.
And that digital path so tragically ended on Saturday, July 12, 2014. Conrad Roy died by suicide in a Kmart parking lot in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. The method was carbon monoxide poisoning in his truck, following those intense final digital exchanges with Carter.
The community's efforts to remember him were immediate and necessary. His funeral was held soon after. And the Captain Conrad H. Roy III Scholarship Fund was established at the Northeast Maritime Institute.
It serves as a permanent reminder of the young man's accomplishments and his potential.
It's just so vital to acknowledge that his death was a profound loss long before it ever became a legal precedent.
Absolutely. The investigation, it quickly centered on Michelle Carter, who was 17 at the time. She was indicted on February 4th, 2015, on charges of involuntary manslaughter, and this specific charge is critical.
It is absolutely foundational to the whole case. She wasn't charged with murder,
Right.
nor was she charged under some specific assisted suicide statute, mainly because Massachusetts doesn't have a law that criminalizes the encouragement or assistance of suicide, unlike some other states.
So the grand jury indictment was for involuntary manslaughter, and they charged her as a youthful offender.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that youthful offender classification, that meant she wasn't treated as a traditional juvenile, correct? What was the practical legal implication of that?
The distinction is huge. If she had been charged as a juvenile, the penalties would have been significantly limited. We're talking about detention until maybe age 18 or 21, and the records would likely have been sealed.
Okay.
By charging her as a youthful offender, the prosecution essentially elevated the case. It allowed for sentencing as an adult.
So what did that mean in terms of a potential sentence?
It meant that the potential penalty, if she were convicted, was a maximum of 20 years in state prison. And that really reflects the gravity of the prosecutor's view of the crime.
The defense, they must have recognized they were stepping into uncharted legal territory here. They immediately challenged the indictment, arguing for dismissal. What were the core pillars of their legal attack?
Their arguments were really twofold, and they both revolved around the Constitution. First, they cited the First Amendment, arguing that Carter's texts, however, abhorrent they might be, were constitutionally protected speech.
Right. The free speech argument.
Exactly. They argue that speech only loses protection when it amounts to a clear incitement of imminent lawless action, which is a very, very high bar. It's generally applied to things like shouting fire in a crowded theater, not private text messages.
Okay, and what was the second pillar?
Causation. They argued that Roy had a deep, pre-existing history of suicidal thoughts and attempts, and that his decision to end his life was entirely his own, completely independent of Carter's input. They said there was no legal chain of causation that linked her words directly to his death.
She didn't provide the means, only the encouragement.
That was their argument, yes.
This legal challenge was so complex that the case went all the way to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, the SJC, before the trial even began.
It did. And in July 2016, the SJC denied the appeal of the indictment, which allowed the case to move forward.
And that decision was the essential legal green light then.
It was. Justice Robert J. Cordy, who was writing for the unanimous court, determined that the evidence did show probable cause for the manslaughter charge. The SJC ruled that the unique nature and the volume of the texts could indicate that Carter used her words not merely as speech, but as a deliberate instrument of persuasion and coercion.
Suggesting that she actually overbore Roy's will.
That's the phrase they used. And this ruling created the necessary legal hook. It allowed the prosecution to bypass the First Amendment argument by claiming the speech itself became an illegal act of coercion, rather than just protected, if hateful, encouragement.
So the SJC essentially said, we recognize this is novel, but the evidence is strong enough that a crime may have occurred, and a trial is necessary to determine the facts of that coercion.
Precisely. They established that the Commonwealth had a credible theory of how digital coercion could constitute reckless behavior leading to death. And that opened the door for Judge Moniz to explore that theory fully at trial.
So when the case finally reached court, Michelle Carter waived her right to a jury trial. The case was heard solely by Judge Lawrence Moniz in the Bristol County Juvenile Court. Why did the defense opt for a bench trial? A trial decided only by a judge in a case so heavily reliant on this emotional, volatile text evidence.
That was a massive strategic decision, and in retrospect, maybe a gamble that backfired. A jury trial would have been highly emotional.
Of course.
It would have been exposed to the graphic nature of the texts and potentially swayed by the public narrative that Carter was manipulative and cold. The defense likely hoped that a trained judge would be less susceptible to that emotion.
And more focused on the strict letter of the law.
Exactly. Specifically, the lack of a Massachusetts statute criminalizing suicide encouragement. They wanted a neutral legal ruling on causation, not a moral judgment on her conduct.
Yet the prosecution's evidence was just overwhelming. It primarily relied on that massive digital footprint.
Yeah.
The thousands of texts, the emails, and even videos Roy made of himself talking to a camera, detailing his despair and the plan.
That digital record provided a truly unprecedented window into his final days. It documented the evolution of the plan, Carter's increasing insistence, and even the methods she suggested to Roy. The court essentially had a minute-by-minute transcript of the crime, even though it lacked a specific statute that defined that crime.
So on June 16, 2017, Judge Moniz found Michelle Carter guilty of involuntary manslaughter. And as we've established, the rationale for this conviction is the most crucial part of this deep dive, because it was so narrowly defined. It didn't rest on the general encouragement leading up to the act.
Absolutely. Judge Moniz was exceptionally clear in his ruling. He said he was focusing on one singular, decisive moment of coercion, the long history of texts that was all used to establish intent and the pattern of encouragement, yes. But the conviction hinged on what Carter did during the final phone call when the act was already in progress.
Okay, let's dedicate some time to breaking this specific finding down, the chain of causation argument. What did the judge determine happened in that Kmart parking lot that so fundamentally changed the legal analysis?
The judge found that Conrad Roy had momentarily ceased the act of self-harm. He had parked the truck, he had started the carbon monoxide generator, and the fumes were filling the cab. But the source material confirms that Roy, in a moment of panic and self-preservation, he exited the truck.
So at that point, the chain of self-causation, that fatal, determined path towards suicide, was broken.
It was broken.
Yeah.
Roy chose life. He was terrified, but he was physically out of that toxic environment.
And this is where Carter's actions through the phone call became criminal. He was outside, he was still alive, and he was still on the phone with her.
Exactly. Now, the phone call itself wasn't recorded, But the content of that call was known because Carter almost immediately afterward detailed the entire conversation in texts to her friends.
She incriminated herself.
In her own words, according to her own admissions, she knew he was out of the truck, safe, but she ordered him to get back in. She texted one friend that Roy said he was scared, and she told him, quote, "Get back in."
So the verdict rationale pivoted entirely on that concept, that Roy's choice to exit the vehicle gave him a momentary reprieve, and Carter's command to return him to the toxic gas actively and recklessly caused his death.
That's it. Moniz concluded that Carter not only wanted Roy dead, which was established by her texts to her friends, but that her words, specifically commanding him back into that sealed vehicle, coerced him into reversing his life-saving decision.
And that act was deemed wanton and reckless encouragement.
Yes. Moniz stated that her insistence that he re-enter the truck amounted to her physically putting him back into danger. And that established the link between her speech and his death that fulfilled the elements of involuntary manslaughter.
It's a remarkably fine line. The court was essentially saying if she had simply encouraged him beforehand, she might have been protected by the First Amendment.
Right.
But because she coerced him back into danger after he had physically removed himself, the speech became an active, physical commission of a crime.
That is the legal tightrope that Moniz walked. By focusing on that moment of physical intervention, the coercion to re-enter the environment of danger, he avoided the constitutional crisis of creating a new law criminalizing generalized encouragement of suicide.
Instead, he just utilized the existing statute for involuntary manslaughter.
And found that her words in that final moment were the direct cause of the continuation of the fatal action.
The public reaction was, of course, immediate and passionate. Roy's father made a brief statement asking for privacy, but confirmed the family was satisfied with the verdict. Roy's mother, Lynn, was much more vocal. She expressed profound relief, but also deep pain, stating publicly that she believed Carter had no conscience and knew exactly what she was doing every step of the way.
The family's statements really highlighted the dual nature of this case. For the courts, it was a legal precedent. But for them, it was simply about finding accountability for the death of their son. Their belief that Carter acted with calculation and malicious intent strongly supported the prosecution's theory that her actions went beyond teenage recklessness and into the realm of criminal intent.
Following that guilty verdict, the sentencing phase began. In August 2017, Judge Moniz sentenced Michelle Carter to 2.5 years, with 15 months to be served in the Bristol County House of Corrections, and then 5 years of probation.
You know, given the gravity of the involuntary manslaughter charge, that sentence was on the lower end. And that reflects the fact that the victim was also actively engaged in the decision, despite the coercion.
Right.
And crucially, due to her legal status, her defense lawyers immediately requested a stay of the sentence. Moniz granted it, which allowed Carter to remain free on bail, pending all of her Massachusetts court appeals.
So nearly 2 years passed between her sentencing and her actually entering a correctional facility.
That's right. The appellate process quickly took shape. The defense continued to hammer that First Amendment argument, maintaining that the conviction criminalized speech. But in February 2019, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, after reviewing the entire trial transcript, upheld the involuntary manslaughter conviction.
So the SJC ruling solidified the principle that Moniz had established.
It did. The SJC stated that Carter's conduct during that final phone call constituted wanton and reckless behavior. The court determined that the evidence demonstrated she knew Roy was in danger and that she commanded him to return to the truck. And that action fulfilled the legal standard for criminal intent in the context of involuntary manslaughter.
And so the 15-month prison sentence was then set to be enforced.
Yes. But even after the state's highest court upheld the verdict, the defense elevated the case even further. They appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States in July of 2019.
This was their last stand.
It was. They were arguing on both First Amendment free speech and Fifth Amendment, which is due process grounds.
So the due process argument was tied to the idea that Massachusetts didn't have a specific law against encouraging suicide.
Exactly, meaning the manslaughter charge was essentially vague and fundamentally unfair. The defense argued that Roy's history of attempts meant the decision to end his life was his own, that Carter was bewildered by the case, and that her conviction violated fundamental rights because she was being prosecuted for words alone.
And they also emphasized the context, a private conversation between two disturbed teenagers.
They did. But in January 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case, which let the Massachusetts conviction stand.
And that refusal was monumental, wasn't it?
It was decisive. While a refusal to hear a case doesn't establish a national precedent, it does signal that the Supreme Court found no pressing federal constitutional violation, either of free speech or due process, that would warrant their intervention. And that effectively sealed Carter's fate and affirmed the state court's specific narrow theory of causation.
Following that denial, Carter began serving her sentence. She entered the correctional facility in February 2019. We know she applied for parole for an early release in September 2019, but that was denied.
Right.
And yet she was released early just a few months later.
She was. She was released on January 23, 2020, having served 11 months and 12 days of her 15-month sentence.
Okay.
And this wasn't due to parole. It was due to standard good conduct reduction.
Okay.
Massachusetts law permits inmates to reduce their sentences by 10 days per month for exemplary behavior. Her conduct was deemed good, so she was allowed to benefit from this reduction. Her 5-year term of probation, however, that continued long after her release.
So beyond the specifics of Carter's time served, the case immediately forced legal experts all over the country to ask, did the Commonwealth v. Michelle Carter decision set a binding legal precedent across the country?
And the answer to that is complex. Legally, no. A Massachusetts lower court decision is not binding on courts in, say, California or Texas.
Yeah.
However, its impact was enormous.
How so?
Legal professionals saw it as a blueprint. It demonstrated a viable constitutional mechanism using existing involuntary manslaughter statutes via this coercion and chain of causation theory to prosecute digital encouragement of suicide, even without a specific assisted suicide law.
So it sort of redefined the social spectrum of criminal conduct. It established that certain kinds of digital immediate coercion could interrupt a victim's own self-preservation efforts, making the speaker criminally responsible for the ensuing death.
Exactly. It put prosecutors on notice. In states that don't have specific suicide encouragement laws, this case offers a pathway. It raised attention to new digital methods of committing crimes, confirming that a keyboard can, under extraordinary circumstances, be viewed as an instrument of lethal force.
And separate from the criminal proceedings, we also have to note the civil suit. Lynn Roy, Conrad's mother, filed a $4.2 million wrongful death lawsuit against Carter in August 2017.
That lawsuit followed the conviction, and it was seeking financial damages for the loss of her son. However, the suit never actually went to trial. The docket record confirms it was dismissed with prejudice and without costs, and publicly reported as resolved.
And that phrasing is standard legal jargon that strongly implies an out-of-court settlement was reached.
Very strongly. While the specific terms are confidential, a settlement in civil court likely put a financial cap on the resolution while also limiting any further public comments from either side about the specifics of the case.
Finally, we can't really discuss this case without acknowledging the immense media saturation. The high-profile nature of it undoubtedly contributed to the national scrutiny of the legal proceedings.
Oh, the media coverage was persistent and it was deep. Programs like 48 Hours and Dateline NBC ran extensive investigations. But the narrative truly exploded with the HBO documentary I Love You Now Die, The Commonwealth vs. Michelle Carter.
That was released in 2019.
Right. And that documentary brought the thousands of texts to life. It illustrated the relationship's descent into darkness and the intimate details of Carter's admissions.
You know, the media attention was fascinating because the focus seemed to shift over time. Initially, it was just shock at the idea of digital coercion. But later, it often shifted to analyzing Carter's own mental health, her need for attention, and the complexity of her motivations.
Especially after her own self-documented admissions of wanting to be the grieving girlfriend.
Right.
And that scrutiny just continued to inspire dramatic interpretations. There was the 2018 Lifetime movie, and more recently, the Hulu series The Girl from Plainville. This sustained coverage ensured that the underlying legal question where the line is drawn between free speech and manslaughter remained a prominent public discussion point for years. It forced people outside the courtroom to grapple with the same narrow legal mechanism that Judge Moniz used.
It highlighted, perhaps more than any other case of its time, just how much the legal process was dependent on those precise digital communications to reconstruct intent, to establish proximity, and ultimately to find causation in a non-physical crime.
It confirmed that in a court of law, digital words are not ephemeral. They are permanent, they are discoverable, and they can serve as crucial evidence of a person's state of mind and the active commission of a crime.
This deep dive into the Roy Carter case has been, it's been difficult. It requires us to hold this immense sympathy for Conrad Roy, while at the same time maintaining an impartial focus on the legal mechanics. It forced the Massachusetts court system to confront the intersection of digital life and criminal law,
Hmm.
And it grew a very precise distinction between words and physical actions when those words are delivered instantly and remotely, leading to a tragic, irreversible outcome.
The real genius, if one can even call it that in such a tragedy, of Judge Moniz' ruling was his narrow focus. The conviction was not about simply being mean or encouraging sad thoughts over a period of weeks.
Mhm.
It was about the active, coercive command delivered at the precise moment the victim was physically attempting to save his own life.
That interruption of the chain of self-causation, Roy getting out of the truck, that was the legal pivot. Carter's words converted protected speech into criminal conduct because they directly caused the continuation of a lethal sequence that the victim himself had successfully paused.
It really highlights how the digital space can just negate physical distance. The judge effectively ruled that Carter was present through her coercive command, and that her action in compelling Roy to return constituted wanton and reckless behavior that resulted in death. The line was drawn not by passing some new law, but by expertly leveraging an old one.
So we've seen how the Massachusetts court drew that very specific line regarding the act of coercion in the digital space. This raises an essential question for you, the listener, to carry forward as you reflect on the facts of this deeply complex case. In an era where human connection is increasingly mediated by screens, how do we distinguish ethically and legally between mere negligence, protected speech, and criminal conduct when words lead directly to tragedy? And where does personal responsibility end when digital influence is involved?